Please, close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the exact sound of a wooden spoon scraping against an old, chipped enamel pot. Try to recall the warm, comforting scent of toasted flour and sweet red paprika filling the tiny kitchen of a panel apartment. Welcome back to the 1970s in Hungary. Today, we are going to take a slow, beautiful walk down memory lane to look at 20 cheap, everyday foods we ate when our pockets were nearly empty, but our hearts and stomachs were somehow always full. These were the meals that defined our childhoods, created by mothers and grandmothers who were true magicians with a tight budget. And please, stay with me until the very end, because the final meal we will remember is one that will surely bring a warm, nostalgic tear to your eye. Life in those days moved at a completely different pace. Time felt slower, thicker, and far more precious. We did not have smartphones to distract us, and we did not have giant supermarkets open around the clock. Instead, we had the local grocery store, the beloved közért, where waiting in line was just an excuse to catch up on neighborhood gossip. People today often look back and think that because we lacked modern technology and endless financial resources, we must have been poor. But they are wrong. We possessed a different kind of wealth. Our wealth was gathered around a small kitchen table covered in a plastic floral tablecloth. It was found in the shared anticipation of Sunday lunch and in the deep, unbreakable connections we forged over simple, humble plates of food. We ate what was available, we wasted absolutely nothing, and we appreciated every single bite. The food was cheap, yes, but the love folded into it was entirely priceless. Now, let us remember one of the most iconic symbols of our childhood, the classic slice of bread with lard. If you grew up in Hungary in the 1970s, you know exactly what I am talking about. This was the ultimate street food before anyone even knew what street food was. Picture the large round loaf of white bread, bought fresh from the local bakery. The crust was thick, dark, and crunchy, while the inside was incredibly soft and airy. Our mothers would cut a slice so thick it felt like a meal in itself. Then came the lard. It was pure white, kept in a cold enamel pot in the pantry. It was spread generously from edge to edge. But the magic was in the toppings. We would slice red onions paper thin, placing them meticulously over the fat. Finally, a heavy dusting of sweet red paprika from Szeged or Kalocsa, which would instantly bleed into the white lard, creating a beautiful crimson mosaic. You would hold this masterpiece in your hands, run down the stairs of the panel building, and eat it while playing football or hide-and-seek with the neighborhood kids. The paprika would stain your fingers and your lips, but you did not care. It cost almost nothing, yet it provided all the energy we needed to play outside until the streetlights flickered on. Next, we must talk about the incredibly comforting potato pasta, known to all of us as krumplistesta. This was the absolute king of budget-friendly dinners. Towards the end of the month, when the family budget was stretched incredibly thin, this dish was a true lifesaver. The process began with boiling potatoes and mashing them perfectly. In a heavy iron pan, a good amount of onions were fried in fat until they were wonderfully translucent and fragrant. Then the ground red paprika was stirred in, instantly transforming the kitchen into a cloud of mouth-watering aromas. The cooked square pasta, the famous cockatiesta, was tossed into this rich, deeply flavorful mixture. The trick was to let it fry just a little bit longer in the pan, allowing some of the pasta edges to become slightly crispy and caramelized. We almost always ate it accompanied by a large, sour, pickled cucumber on the side, served on those classic white porcelain plates with a thin gold or blue rim. It was a heavy, starchy, incredibly satisfying meal that warmed your entire body on a damp, chilly autumn evening. It was simple peasant food, but to us, it tasted absolutely spectacular. And what about the most magical, inexpensive sweet treat a child could ask for? I am talking about bread with butter and crystal sugar. In today's world of fancy bakeries and elaborate chocolate bars, this might sound completely absurd to younger generations, but for us it was pure heaven. You would take a slightly dry slice of white bread, because fresh bread was reserved for main meals. You would spread a thin layer of butter, or more likely, the slightly yellow, salty margarine that was common back then. Then, you would reach into the pantry for the blue paper bag of crystal sugar. You would sprinkle the sugar heavily over the butter, making sure every single millimeter was covered. The texture was unforgettable. When you took a bite, the soft bread and the creamy butter gave way to the loud, satisfying crunch of the large sugar crystals against your teeth. It was an instant rush of sweetness. Kids would sit on the concrete steps of their apartment buildings, happily chewing on their sugar bread, sharing secrets and trading stamps or marbles. It was a dessert born out of pure necessity. Yet it brought us a level of joy that money simply could not buy. Let us turn our minds to the gentle, soothing magic of semolina pudding, our beloved tejbegris. This was the ultimate comfort food, often served for dinner when our mothers were exhausted from a long day of work at the factory or the office. You would hear the milk gently simmering on the gas stove. The trick was to pour the semolina in a slow, steady stream while constantly whisking, making absolutely sure no horrible lumps formed in the pot. It thickened rapidly, transforming from a thin liquid into a rich, creamy, bubbling porridge. It was ladled hot into deep soup bowls, but the true ritual was in the topping. We did not use fancy chocolates. We used a generous spoonful of sweetened cocoa powder, scattered entirely over the pristine white surface. If you were patient enough to wait, the heat of the pudding would slowly melt the cocoa powder into a dark, glossy, muddy pool of intense sweetness. Some children liked to mix it all together until it became a uniform brown color, while others carefully ate around the edges to preserve the beautiful pattern. It was a bowl of pure, unadulterated childhood innocence. When winter arrived and the freezing winds blew through the streets, nothing cured the cold quite like a hot bowl of caraway seed soup. This was the legendary Kemeny Maglev's, perhaps the most brilliant example of making something out of literally nothing. It started with a simple spoonful of fat or oil in a pot. The caraway seeds were added and toasted until they began to pop and dance, releasing an incredibly warm, nutty, earthy fragrance that filled the entire house. A little flour was stirred in to create a roux, followed by a splash of cold water and a dash of sweet paprika to give it a beautiful, golden red hue. It was just water, fat, flour, and spices, but it tasted like a feast. To make it filling, we would add croutons made from stale, leftover bread, toasted on the stove until they were hard and crispy. The hot soup would soften the bread just enough so it absorbed all that wonderful, savory flavor. Eating this soup felt like being wrapped in a thick, warm blanket. It was a testament to the resilience and creativity of our parents, who knew exactly how to warm our souls even when the pantry was completely bare. Sunday mornings in a Hungarian household often meant one specific, glorious smell wafting through the corridors. It was the smell of bundáskenyér, our savory, incredibly satisfying version of French toast. By Sunday, the bread bought on Thursday was starting to get hard and difficult to chew. But a Hungarian mother never threw bread away. Instead, she would crack a few eggs into a deep plate, beat them with a fork, and add a generous pinch of salt. The stale slices of bread were submerged in the egg, soaking up the yellow liquid like a sponge. Then, they were carefully dropped into a pan of sizzling hot sunflower oil. The sound of the crackling oil was the perfect Sunday alarm clock. The bread puffed up, turning golden brown and perfectly crispy on the outside, while remaining soft and incredibly rich on the inside. The absolute best part of the ritual was taking a raw clove of garlic, slicing it in half, and rubbing it vigorously over the rough, hot crust of the fried bread. Served alongside a steaming mug of hot black tea flavored with lemon juice and too much sugar, it was a breakfast fit for kings, made from scraps. Let us think about a dish that often sparked friendly, passionate debates at the family dining table: the famous cabbage pasta or kapostas testa. Making this was a labor of love that required time and elbow grease. A massive head of cheap, white winter cabbage had to be grated by hand on a box grater. It was then heavily salted and left to rest before the water was squeezed out by strong hands. The grated cabbage was slowly caramelized in a large pot with a little fat and sugar. It took a long time, sometimes an hour, for the pale vegetable to turn a deep, rich, golden brown. The smell was sweet, earthy, and unmistakably comforting. Once mixed with the cooked square pasta, the great family divide occurred. Half of the family would insist on sprinkling it with freshly ground, spicy black pepper, celebrating the savory, slightly sharp flavors. The other half would cover it in a snowy mountain of powdered sugar, creating a bizarre but beautiful, sweet and savory masterpiece. Regardless of how you ate it, it was an incredibly cheap way to feed a family of 5, leaving everyone deeply satisfied and ready for an afternoon nap. Fridays in many households were traditionally meatless days, a lingering cultural habit. On these days, the heavy cast-iron poppy seed grinder was securely clamped to the edge of the kitchen table. It was time for mákos testa, the legendary poppy seed pasta. As a child, turning the small crank of the grinder was a favorite chore. You could hear the rhythmic crunching sound as the tiny blue seeds were crushed into a dark, fragrant, slightly oily powder. The smell of freshly ground poppy seeds is something truly unique, deeply earthy, and slightly floral. The dark powder was generously mixed with powdery confectioner's sugar. Meanwhile, a huge pot of white noodles was boiled until tender. The hot, steaming pasta was drained and immediately tossed with the sweet poppy seed mixture. The heat melted the sugar, coating every single noodle in a dark, sweet, gravel-like texture. Eating it was a messy affair. You would always end up with tiny black specks stuck between your teeth, smiling a wide, dotted smile at your siblings across the table. It was a dish that felt like a dessert, yet we happily ate it as a main course. When August arrived, bringing unbearable heat to the cities, the local markets overflowed with mountains of cheap, vibrant vegetables. This was the glorious season of Lexo. When tomatoes and wax peppers were so abundant they cost mere pennies, every single family cooked this fantastic vegetable stew. The ritual began with slicing onions, which always brought tears to our mother's eyes. Then came the pale yellow wax peppers, sliced into rings, and the incredibly juicy, sun-ripened red tomatoes. They were all thrown into a large pot with a spoonful of fat and a heavy dose of paprika. As it cooked down, the vegetables released their juices, melding into a sweet, slightly spicy, intensely flavorful red sauce. Some families might add a single, cheap Debreceni sausage for flavor, but often it was just pure vegetables. The only acceptable way to eat lekso was with a giant, thick heel of fresh white bread. You would use the bread to mop up every last drop of the oily red paprika juice from the bottom of your deep plate. It tasted like summer itself, vibrant, messy, and absolutely unforgettable. Another masterpiece of simplicity was potato paprika, or paprika skrumpli. This dish is the very definition of Hungarian soul food, utilizing the holy trinity of our cuisine: fat, onions, and paprika. The potatoes were peeled and cut into uneven chunks, dropping into the pot with a satisfying thud. They were stirred into the deeply red, fragrant onion and paprika base, then covered with just enough water to let them simmer. The beauty of this dish was how the starch from the potatoes naturally thickened the broth, turning it into a rich, velvety gravy. If we had a little extra money, a few slices of smoked sausage were added, their fat melting into the sauce and lending it a deep, smoky aroma. But even without meat, just the potatoes and the rich paprika sauce, it was a culinary triumph. We ate it with huge slices of bread and perhaps a few pieces of pickled vegetables from the pantry. The smell of paprika skrumpli bubbling on the stove made the tiny apartment feel like a grand, safe fortress against the outside world. It was a meal that told you, no matter how little money we had, you would never go to bed hungry. As the warm months faded and the grey, freezing Hungarian winter set in, our cravings shifted to things that could warm us from the inside out. One of the cheapest and most wonderful winter treats was simply baked pumpkin, or sylttök. At the market, you could buy massive crescent-shaped slices of raw pumpkin for incredibly cheap prices. Our mothers would take these heavy orange wedges, place them on a flat baking sheet, and slide them into the hot gas oven. As they baked, something magical happened. The edges of the pumpkin would begin to caramelize, turning dark brown and sometimes even a little black and crispy. A thick, sweet, earthy syrup would slowly weep from the flesh, filling the entire kitchen with a fragrance that rivaled any expensive bakery. When it was pulled from the oven, it was too hot to touch. We would sit around the table, armed with small metal spoons, carefully scraping the soft, incredibly sweet, bright orange flesh away from the tough green skin. It was nature's candy, roasted to perfection, providing warmth and comfort on days when the sun set by 4 in the afternoon. Do you remember the intense joy of finding your own name floating in your soup? Alphabet tomato soup, or porodics omleves betűtésztával, was a childhood staple that we all adored. The base of the soup often came from a tall glass bottle of tomato juice, preserved by our grandmothers during the summer. It was poured into a pot, sweetened with a surprising amount of sugar, and flavored with a whole leafy stalk of fresh celery, which gave it a wonderfully earthy undertone. But the true excitement began when the tiny dry alphabet pasta was tossed into the boiling red liquid. We would sit at the table, clutching our spoons, waiting impatiently for the soup to cool down. Then the game began. We would carefully fish out the tiny swollen pasta letters, placing them on the wide rim of the porcelain soup bowl. We would spell our names, our pets' names, or funny words, completely ignoring our mothers telling us not to play with our food. The soup was sweet, slightly tart, and endlessly entertaining. It made eating lunch feel like a wonderful secret game. When summer heat waves hit the concrete panel buildings, the air became thick and heavy. The only remedy was a giant icy bowl of cold, sour cherry soup, the legendary megileves. The preparation was a family event. We would sit on the balcony with bowls of fresh, dark red sour cherries, spending hours removing the pits. Our fingers and nails would be stained a deep purple for days afterward. The cherries were boiled with water, lots of sugar, a cinnamon stick, and a few whole cloves. The smell was intoxicating, spicy and sweet. But the true magic happened when our mothers tempered a large dollop of rich, thick tafel, the Hungarian sour cream, and slowly whisked it into the hot soup. The dark red liquid instantly transformed into a beautiful, creamy, pastel pink masterpiece. It was then placed in the refrigerator for hours. We would eat it ice cold, the sweet and sour flavors bursting in our mouths, the cold liquid soothing our throats after a long day running around in the blazing sun. It was a soup, but to us, it was the ultimate summer dessert. Let us recall a dish that sounds entirely bizarre to foreigners, but is deeply beloved by every single Hungarian. The hearty and wonderful turos csusa, or quark cheese pasta. This was a masterclass in contrasting flavors and textures. White, flat pasta was boiled until soft. The star of the show was the Hungarian turo, a crumbly, slightly sour, dry fresh cheese that has no exact equivalent anywhere else in the world. This cheese was crumbled generously over the hot pasta. Then came a massive, decadent spoonful of cold, thick sour cream. The contrast between the steaming hot pasta and the cold sour cream was absolutely thrilling. And if we were very lucky, if it was a good week financially, the dish was crowned with tiny, perfectly fried, crispy cubes of smoked bacon, the glorious salonna. The salty crunch of the bacon, the creamy coolness of the sour cream, the tang of the cheese, and the comforting weight of the pasta created a symphony in the mouth. It was a heavy, calorie-dense meal designed to keep hard-working people full for hours, and we absolutely adored every single bite of it. No memory of a 1970s Hungarian summer is complete without the sight of large glass jars sitting patiently in the blazing sun. This was the ancient, beautiful ritual of making kovászos uborka, our famous sun-fermented pickles. Fresh, bumpy pickling cucumbers were scrubbed clean and packed tightly into a massive jar. A large bunch of mature, flowering dill and several whole cloves of garlic were shoved in between the vegetables. The jar was filled with warm, salty water, and then came the most crucial step, placing a thick slice of stale white bread right at the very top, submerged in the liquid. A small saucer was placed over the opening, and the jar was left on the sunny windowsill or the balcony for 3 or 4 days. We would watch the liquid turn cloudy and bubbly as the magic of fermentation took over. When they were finally ready, the smell was sharp, garlicky, and incredibly sour. The cucumbers were olive green, incredibly crunchy, and packed with a tangy flavor that made your jaw tingle. Eating a cold kovászos uborka straight from the fridge with just a piece of fresh bread was the absolute taste of a Hungarian summer. When we were incredibly hungry but there was no time to cook, we relied on the humble yet deeply satisfying tin of liver paste, the classic mai crème. These came in tiny, round aluminium cans with a distinct pull tab. Popping that tin open revealed a smooth, pale pink, densely packed pork liver paste. It was salty, savory, and spread beautifully over a slice of white bread. This was the ultimate quick snack. A mother would quickly spread the paste, perhaps lay a thin slice of green TV paprika or a juicy wedge of tomato on top, and hand it to us as we stood in the doorway, eager to get back to playing outside. Sometimes, if we were out on a school trip or a long hike in the Buddha Hills, these little tins of mykrem were packed in our knapsacks. Sitting on a wooden bench in the forest, opening a tin with a pocket knife and eating it with a slightly squished piece of bread felt like an absolute feast. It was cheap, it was processed, but it held a specific, salty flavor that instantly transports us back to the playgrounds of our youth. Can you remember the heavy, humid evenings of late summer, filled with the sweet, starchy scent of boiling corn on the cob? Fyt kukorica was not just food, it was an event. Huge, chipped enamel pots, the biggest ones the family owned, were placed on the gas stove. They were filled to the brim with water, yellow ears of corn, and covered with the green, fibrous husks to lock in the flavor. The pot boiled for what felt like hours, the windows fogging up from the thick, sweet steam. When it was finally ready, the hot cobs were carefully lifted out with wooden tongs. We would juggle the burning hot corn in our bare hands, blowing on it frantically. The only seasoning needed was a brutal amount of salt, rubbed aggressively over the kernels. The sweet, juicy pops of the corn combined with the harsh, savory bite of the salt was pure perfection. We ate it sitting on the balcony, watching the sun go down, our faces and hands covered in sticky, sweet corn juice. It was the cheapest feast summer had to offer, and we never, ever grew tired of it. When a birthday or a special occasion approached, but there was absolutely no money for a fancy bakery cake, our mothers created a miracle called kekstekers, the beloved no-bake biscuit roll. It started with plain, inexpensive Albert biscuits. We were often given the task of crushing them. We would put the biscuits in a clean plastic bag and brutally smash them with a wooden rolling pin until they became a fine powder. This powder was mixed with dark cocoa, sugar, and a splash of strong leftover black espresso coffee to create a dark, pliable dough. This dough was rolled out flat on a piece of wax paper. A rich, intensely sweet cream made from butter and powdered sugar was spread thickly over the dark base. Then, with careful hands, it was rolled up tightly into a log and rolled again in shredded white coconut. The absolute worst part of this recipe was the agony of waiting. It had to sit in the cold refrigerator overnight to set properly. Slicing it the next day revealed a beautiful hypnotic spiral of dark cocoa and stark white cream. It was a masterpiece of thriftiness and love. Another brilliant way our mothers stretched a tiny amount of expensive meat to feed a hungry family was by making töltet paprika, the iconic stuffed peppers. They would buy the pale yellow, thin-walled wax peppers, cut the tops off, and meticulously remove the seeds. The filling was a mixture of a little bit of minced pork, onions, spices, and a very large amount of cooked white rice. The rice was the secret, acting as a delicious sponge that made the meat go much further. These plump, stuffed peppers were then carefully dropped into a large pot of simmering, sweet and savory tomato sauce, heavily flavored with celery leaves. As they cooked, the peppers softened, and the meat and rice absorbed the rich tomato broth. It was served in deep plates, usually alongside a few boiled potatoes to ensure not a single drop of the glorious red sauce was wasted. The smell of this dish cooking on a Sunday morning is permanently etched into our memories. It tasted like home, like security, and like the ingenious care of a mother providing for her family. Finally, we come to a dessert that is perhaps the simplest and most poignant of all: baked apples, or syltalma. In the dead of winter, when fresh fruit was incredibly scarce and expensive, we relied on the apples stored in the cold cellar. By January or February, these apples were often bruised, wrinkled, and slightly soft. They were no longer good for eating raw, but our grandmothers knew exactly what to do. They would core the apples and place them in a baking dish. Sometimes they would sprinkle a little cinnamon and sugar inside, or perhaps add a tiny spoonful of cheap plum jam if we had it. They were baked until the skin wrinkled completely and the flesh collapsed into a steaming, hot, fragrant puree. The whole house smelled of warm cinnamon and baked sugar. Eating that hot, sweet apple on a freezing winter night, sitting near the warm radiator, wrapped in a blanket, was a moment of profound peace. It was just a wrinkled old apple, but through patience and care, it was challenged into a dessert that brought total comfort to our souls. As we look back at these 20 humble meals, it becomes so clear that what we are truly nostalgic for is not just the food itself. We do not just miss the cheap bread or the simple pasta. We deeply miss the time when we were young, when our parents and grandmothers were still with us, standing in those small kitchens, cooking with so much love. We miss the slow, uninterrupted hours spent around the family table, where a simple bowl of potato paprika was enough to make us feel entirely safe and infinitely happy. The world has changed, and our plates are fuller now, but those vintage flavors will forever remain the most precious treasures of our hearts. If this journey brought back warm memories for you, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video to help keep these beautiful stories alive. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these cheap, wonderful meals was your absolute favorite growing up? Or is there another dish you remember? Please, share your personal stories in the comments below. I read every single one.